He went through many different phases as a child, fascinated by one thing and then another. But looking back, I suppose I have to admit I was probably just a pony-obsessed kid in the end. It was meant to be a calm evening of music and tradition, a private royal concert inside the polished halls of Windsor Castle. The kind of night where string quartets played softly beneath glittering chandeliers, guests sipped champagne between rounds of polite applause, and the royal children, perfectly dressed, took turns sharing their carefully nurtured talents. No press, no cameras, just family, music, and a quiet sense of generational pride. Prince Louis, growing into a bright and articulate little boy, had been preparing for this night for weeks. He'd fallen in love with the piano under his mother's gentle guidance, her own love for the arts reflecting that of the late Princess Diana. His small, hesitant fingers moved through simple classical pieces, not aiming for perfection, but carrying an undeniable honesty in every note. But what happened that evening tested more than the innocence of a royal recital. It exposed the quiet cruelties that still linger behind palace walls, the sly humiliations masked as laughter, and the unspoken rule that not every guest honors the sanctity of royal upbringing. Sitting just feet from the piano was a world-renowned pianist, invited by the palace both to perform and to mentor. He had the brilliance of a master and the sharp tongue of a cynic. After Louis finished his short introduction and glanced modestly toward his parents, the guest leaned slightly to the side, smirked, and murmured something he didn't realize would change the mood of the entire room. "Cute fingers," he said. "Shame they're wasted." A few chuckles followed. Maybe it was a joke, maybe arrogance. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Princess Charlotte heard every word. Her brother's shining moment was brushed aside in a single remark. Something shifted right then. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She watched quietly. She kept her composure. Then, with calm precision, she rose to her feet. Charlotte's choice that night left a mark on the palace, but it also reflected the quiet evolution happening within her. A little girl raised under the weight of a legacy, Kate's daughter, Diana's granddaughter. And in that room, crowded with titles and egos, it was Charlotte, not the crown, who ended the evening with the defining gesture. But before we continue, we'd love for you to hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying this video. If you just did, we truly appreciate it. Now, let's get back to the main content. Everything about the night suggested a classic Windsor occasion. Golden light spilling across the ornate ceiling, guests wrapped in velvet and silk, and that expectant hush that always surrounds royal moments involving children. But this was not just another event. It was an intentionally curated tradition, one Kate had quietly revived in recent years to honor Diana's love for music and to remind the younger royals that greatness begins with passion, not duty. The family gathered inside the Queen's drawing room, which had been transformed into an intimate music hall, a cherished ritual many saw as a gentle family tradition. A hand-picked audience of extended royals, aristocratic friends, and a few cultural figures sat neatly in rows of polished mahogany chairs. At the front, a gleaming baby grand piano from Vienna stood ready, its keys waiting for the touch of small hands. Prince Louis, in a smart blue jacket with a crimson pocket square echoing William's childhood style, sat in the front row, his posture straight and his eyes bright. He had been practicing for weeks. Every morning after breakfast and every evening before bed, Kate knelt beside him, softly correcting his stance and guiding his fingers. Music had become their shared sanctuary, a quiet bond in a world where ceremony often left little space for curiosity. The program opened gracefully. A visiting young prodigy performed a cello solo. Then Princess Charlotte stepped forward, reciting a poem she had written herself. A tender piece about courage, inspired by a recent school trip. George stayed backstage this year, cheering from the wings. And then it was Louis's moment. He stood, straightened his blazer, and walked to the piano with deliberate steps. The room applauded warmly, offering encouragement. Kate's smile glowed across the room. William gave a proud nod. But behind the polished calm, everyone knew this was a defining moment for the young prince. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched the keys. The first notes of a simple Mozart melody floated out, light and hesitant. Some notes were too soft, others a bit out of time, but every one of them was full of sincerity. His foot shifted nervously under the bench. When the piece ended, he paused, looked up, and searched the room for approval, not just from his parents, but from everyone present. The audience responded with polite applause and murmured praise, but not every reaction was kind. At the center of the front row sat the guest of honor, a celebrated pianist whose fame carried both acclaim and scandal. He had been invited to inspire, but instead he leaned toward the ambassador beside him, a smirk curling on his lips, and whispered something sharp enough to cut the air. "Cute fingers," he muttered, voice cool and brittle. "Shame they're wasted." The ambassador let out an awkward laugh. One of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting squinted, unsure if she'd heard correctly, but Charlotte had. Every word. And unlike the adults, she didn't brush it aside. She had been watching Louis intently, her hands clasped in her lap. His performance felt like hers too, their bond built on admiration, not rivalry. Charlotte had once told her mother she wanted to be brave like Granny Diana. That night she saw her brother do something brave, and then saw that courage mocked as if it were nothing more than a school play. Her eyes moved toward the piano. Her lips didn't move, but her expression sharpened, not with tears but with calculation. At just 9, she already understood more than most of the adults around her. In the royal family, children are taught to smile, to stay quiet, to let things go. But Charlotte hadn't fully embraced that lesson. Not yet. She'd learned something else instead. Loyalty. In that grand room, filled with titles, posturing, and hidden cruelties, something stirred. The start of a quiet defiance. Not against the monarchy, but against the casual contempt that came with it. No one noticed her stand, not at first. But Charlotte, even as a child, held something far greater than applause. As the pianist would soon learn, she carried a spark. Princess Charlotte had always stood apart in royal circles, where every word and gesture was measured, rehearsed, and approved. Her strength wasn't in loud rebellion, but in choosing her moments, carefully, deliberately, to bend the rules. She was never the silent one. Charlotte carried a flame that no etiquette guide could dim. That fire burned brightest when her family was at risk. Her personal code, unwritten but absolute, placed devotion above ceremony. She had already defended her brother before. At last year's Trooping the Color, during a private lunch at Buckingham Palace, a royal cousin joked that Louis would end up as a royal mascot rather than a true prince. Charlotte didn't hesitate. She looked at him and replied calmly, "He'll still do more than most people who only laugh." The room went still. Even Princess Anne raised an eyebrow. Kate didn't scold her. Later that evening, she quietly took Charlotte aside and said, "You have your grandmother's courage. Use it carefully." Charlotte was doing exactly that. When she returned to the recital room at Windsor, she still hadn't spoken a word, but everything about her posture had shifted. The usually graceful stance of a young princess had hardened, her frame locked tight like carved stone. She sat rigid, arms folded, eyes fixed on the musician who had humiliated her brother. No one else reacted. The adults either hadn't heard or pretended not to. Even William, composed to the last detail, betrayed only the slightest flicker of a clenched jaw. But Charlotte wasn't built from decades of training and royal habit. What she had was instinct and love. As the next performer, a shy violinist from a family friend's home, stepped onto the stage. Charlotte made her move. She rose quietly, without seeking a nod from her parents. Not abrupt, not dramatic, just enough to draw attention. Her sneakers tapped softly against the floor as she walked to the front, and heads began to turn, one by one, following her path. The pianist, mid-conversation with the envoy, glanced up and saw the princess approaching. He assumed she was curious, maybe drawn in by his prestige. He smiled, a wide, artificial smile. Charlotte stopped in front of him, folding her hands neatly. "I liked my brother's piece," she said, voice steady. "Did you?" The question slipped into the room like a velvet blade. The pianist blinked, caught off balance. "Oh, yes. Delightful," he stammered. "Very charming." Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "Because I heard you say his fingers were wasted. Do you usually talk about children that way?" A ripple of gasps echoed from the back. One of the ladies in waiting set down her program. Kate straightened in her chair. Camilla, seated a few rows behind, narrowed her eyes and leaned in, sensing control slipping through her fingers. Charlotte's voice stayed calm, but carried a weight beyond her 9 years. "Mommy says people who make others feel small are usually scared of something." The pianist opened his mouth, then shut it again. There was no graceful retreat. Charlotte dipped into a small, deliberate curtsy, then turned and walked back to her seat, as if nothing had happened. The pianist sat frozen. The room did too. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a headline-grabbing scandal. This was something far more unsettling to the old guard. A young princess, fully aware of her own worth and her brother's, speaking it out loud. Charlotte had broken the rules, no doubt, but in doing so, she may have written a new one. When she settled back into her chair, the recital room fell into an unfamiliar stillness. Not the neat silence before applause, not the uneasy pause after a bad speech. This was a sharp, reverent, almost disbelieving hush. No one quite knew how to respond. The pianist, long celebrated for his composure and brilliance, looked shaken. His fingers, the same ones that had glided across the world's greatest stages, twitched slightly, as if unsure where to rest. Beside him, the ambassador flushed red and stared at the floor, studying his program like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever read. And then, someone clapped. Not for Louis, not for the pianist, for Charlotte. A hesitant tap of hands from the back row grew into another, and another, until the applause rolled forward, hesitant at first, then swelling into a quiet, reluctant, and finally undeniable standing ovation. Not because she was a child who spoke up, but because she did it without spite, without drama, without raising her voice. She had held up a mirror to a room full of polished faces, and she'd done it with the grace of someone far beyond her years. It wasn't only about grace. It was about heritage. Princess Anne, seated off to the side, leaned toward her aide and whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear. Her lips pressed into a firm line, her posture sharpened. Anne had always placed duty to the crown above loyalty to family. And in her eyes, Charlotte had stepped into dangerous territory. Not because she was wrong, but because she had acted on her own. Public correction, especially from a child, didn't just sting. It cracked the hierarchy. It bent the unwritten rule. Camilla, meanwhile, made her displeasure plain. Her eyes narrowed into that well-practiced look, the same one she'd worn decades earlier when standing beside Diana at stiff public events. She leaned closer to Charles and muttered, "This is what happens when children are given too much freedom." Charles said nothing. His attention stayed on William, who now rested a hand gently over Kate's. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their daughter had just defended their youngest son in front of some of the kingdom's most powerful guests, and she hadn't wavered. As the evening went on, the mood shifted. The performances that followed were polished, even flawless, but the spirit had dimmed. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Had they just watched the future of the monarchy take shape before their eyes? The final act, a harp solo by a distant cousin, closed the program. The pianist was meant to finish the night with an improvised performance. But when his name was called, he declined softly. "Perhaps another time," he murmured, standing with a slow half-bow. No one caught the irony. A man who had once commanded the world's stages had just been quieted. Not by scandal, not by outrage, but by a child who wielded something rarer than music: composure. And she used it with the precision of a princess who understood not only the weight of a crown, but the responsibility to shield the ones she loved from those who wore theirs carelessly. Charlotte didn't smile afterward. She didn't revel in it. She simply returned to her seat, slipped her hand into Louis's, and gave it a gentle squeeze. Louis didn't say a word, but his shoulders eased, his face softened. Because in that moment, he didn't need applause. He didn't need praise from the elite. He had something far stronger. His sister had seen him. And when no one else stood, she had. If there's one thing Camilla cannot abide, it's disruption. Especially when it comes from someone younger, sharper, and more beloved than herself. And on this night, that disruption arrived in a navy dress and ballerina flats, carrying a voice soft enough to still a music hall. Camilla had stayed composed during the exchange, as only she could. While most of the audience shifted from surprise to admiration, she saw something else entirely. A 9-year-old who had broken layer after layer of royal tradition and openly corrected a guest. A child who used the force of truth, not rank, to command the room. It unsettled her deeply. As the guests drifted into the reception room for drinks and polite conversation, Camilla quietly pulled one of her senior aides aside. "Where is Charlotte?" Camilla asked, her eyes scanning the room near the fireplace. "Your Majesty," the assistant replied carefully. "She's with Prince Louis and Lady Catherine." Camilla nodded, her expression unreadable. She seized the moment while Kate chatted with a circle of arts patrons and William checked in with a distant relative. Gliding across the room, she positioned herself directly in Charlotte's line of sight, her smile perfectly practiced for occasions like this. "My dear," Camilla said, leaning in just slightly. "A word?" Charlotte looked up, wary but polite. She gave the smallest nod and followed her into a side corridor, away from the hum of voices. The queen consort didn't need to raise her voice. She never did. But her tone, low and deliberate, carried a chill even Windsor's thick stone walls couldn't soften. "I understand you were upset," she began, carefully measured. "But you must remember, we do not confront guests, especially not in public. There is a time and a place for everything." Charlotte didn't respond right away. She just stood still, waiting. Camilla continued. "You're a royal. Your role is to show composure, even when others don't." Charlotte blinked once. "Even when they insult my brother?" For the first time, Camilla's smile faltered. "We rise above it," she said firmly. "Royalty doesn't stoop. We endure." Charlotte, unwilling to shrink back, answered evenly, her tone calm but steady. "Mommy says we're not here to impress people who look down on others. We're here to teach them how to treat people better." It wasn't sass. It wasn't defiance. It was conviction. Camilla's jaw tightened. She stepped closer, lowering her voice even further. "You might want to think carefully about how you behave in public. Princesses are seen, not heard." Before Charlotte could answer, another voice cut through the corridor. "She's heard just fine." Kate, poised as ever, but with a tone sharp enough to slice the air. She had followed them quietly, sensing something brewing. "She was protecting her brother," Kate said, moving between them. "Something any mother, or grandmother, should understand. Camilla straightened, her smile snapping back into place like a mask. Of course, I was only— Are you correcting her? Kate interrupted, her gaze unwavering. Because from where I stood, Charlotte handled herself better than most adults in that room? For a brief moment, the narrow passage held 3 generations of royal women. One bound to the old rules, one shaping the new, and one standing in the middle, figuring out who she would become. Camilla stepped back with a small nod, but not before casting Charlotte one last look. It wasn't anger. It was colder, something closer to recognition. The little girl who once waved sweetly from palace balconies was no longer just part of the backdrop. She was stepping forward, and fast. Kate rested her hand on Charlotte's shoulder as Camilla disappeared down the hall. "You okay?" she whispered. Charlotte nodded. "I didn't yell." Kate smiled softly. "You didn't need to. The strongest voices rarely shout. They simply say enough to be heard, especially when someone wishes they hadn't said anything at all." By the time the guests left Windsor and the chandeliers dimmed, many assumed the evening's drama would fade into the palace's quiet history. Just another story swallowed by the walls. But Charlotte's small act of defiance echoed further than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, whispers of the moment slipped beyond the castle gates. There were no official statements, no leaked videos. As with most private royal events, no cameras were present. But someone, an aide, a distant cousin, or a cultural guest, couldn't keep it to themselves. The story was too striking, too different. It first surfaced as a brief, anonymous tidbit in the lifestyle column of a major London paper. The future queen wore no crown. She wore navy blue, defended her brother, and said what no one else dared to say. That single line caught fire online. Within hours, royal watchers on X, formerly Twitter, were dissecting every detail. Fan accounts posted unverified stories, each one more admiring than the last. Artists sketched digital portraits of Charlotte standing before a stunned crowd. Hashtags like #PrincessProtector and #CharlotteStans trended across the UK. And the reaction triggered something the palace had not seen coming: a generational shift in public sentiment. For years, the monarchy had tried to refresh its image, to balance tradition with relevance. And here, without a plan, without even meaning to, a 9-year-old girl had done more in one night than the entire royal PR machine had managed in months. Suddenly, the image of the monarchy didn't look like stiff balcony waves or rehearsed silence anymore. It looked like a little girl standing up for her brother. People noticed the difference. Camilla, sensing the shift, released a carefully worded press note days later, praising the talents and creative spirit of royal children. It was polite, bland, and, most telling of all, name-free. Kate, in contrast, issued nothing official. Instead, she posted a new photo on Kensington Palace's Instagram. Charlotte and Louis at a piano, Charlotte pointing at a sheet of music with a bright smile, Louis laughing beside her. The caption? Just a red heart and the words, "Practice makes joy." The post exploded online. The story wasn't just being discussed over breakfast in classrooms or on evening broadcasts. It became the way people were talking about the royal family. The idea of a young princess quietly stepping in to shield her sibling wasn't just touching, it felt like a turning point. What was meant to be a small, elegant showcase of the softer side of royalty had revealed something much bigger, a change in the emotional balance of power. And whether the palace approved or not, the public had chosen their new favorite royal. Not for her title, for who she was. In a monarchy where silence has long equaled survival, Princess Charlotte didn't shake tradition with rebellion or scandal. She reshaped it with simplicity. Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Her actions were small, but they carried grace. She didn't speak to shame anyone. She spoke to protect. And in doing so, She reminded the world that royalty isn't forged in tiaras and titles. It's built in quiet moments, unexpected courage, and the decisions you make when no one thinks you will. For years, the public wondered about the monarchy's future. Who would modernize it? Who might crumble beneath it? No one expected a 9-year-old girl with her mother's warmth and her grandmother's steel to be the one to show them the answer. Charlotte didn't break royal tradition. She refined it. She reclaimed it. Because while many saw her as merely the spare to the heir, she showed something deeper. She is the calm in the chaos, the compass in the storm, and above all, the sister who stood up when even the grown-ups stayed seated. That night at Windsor was supposed to be about music, but the most powerful performance didn't come from the piano. It came from a princess who rewrote the melody and played a new tune the world will never forget.